Damon Price was 42 years old, and he had built everything from nothing. The son of a Memphis mechanic, he'd spent 15 years constructing an infrastructure consulting firm worth more than anyone in his neighborhood had ever imagined possible. He had a beautiful home, a thriving business, and a wife who smiled at him every morning. What he didn't know was that the smile had been a performance for 4 years. The morning of the hearing, Crystal made him breakfast for the first time in 2 years, kissed him on the cheek. It felt like a period at the end of a sentence, and he was right. In open court, a judge awarded her $5 million of everything he'd built. Crystal turned and looked directly at him and smiled the way someone smiles when they've already won. She walked into that marble corridor and called someone on her phone. Damon could hear her voice, bright, victorious, telling them, "It's done, just like we planned." Then, 63 minutes later, a court officer found them both and said the judge was calling them back inside. What happened in that courtroom next would cost Crystal everything she thought she'd just won. But she still had no idea what Damon had already set in motion 3 weeks ago, and hadn't said a single word about since. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The early morning light hadn't yet touched the windows of Damon Price's home office when he settled into his favorite chair at the drafting table. The clock on the wall showed 5:47 a.m., his usual time. He liked these quiet hours before the world fully woke up, when he could think clearly without interruption. The documents spread before him looked straightforward enough. Harold Bryce, his attorney, had called it a routine civil proceeding, just some paperwork about Crystal's co-ownership stake from that business restructuring 2 years ago. Nothing to worry about, Harold had said. Damon ran his finger along the edge of one contract, feeling the slight ridge of the paper. Growing up watching his father run that mechanic shop in South Memphis had taught him to pay attention to details. John Price wasn't a wealthy man, but he'd built something real, a business people trusted, a name that meant something. "Always read everything twice," his father used to say, bent over an invoice at the kitchen table. "The devil's in what you skip." Damon had taken that lesson to heart when he started Price Infrastructure Consulting 15 years ago. Every contract, every design, every load calculation, he checked them all personally. That attention to detail had grown his firm from a one-man operation to a team of 8, with federal contracts and a solid reputation in 3 states. The house around him was quiet, except for the soft hum of the heating system he'd upgraded last fall. Crystal was probably still getting ready upstairs. This morning, she'd surprised him with breakfast, eggs and toast, coffee already poured. She'd even kissed him goodbye, a quick peck on the cheek that felt somehow final, like punctuation. He couldn't remember the last time she'd made breakfast. 2 years, maybe? Around the time she started spending more evenings with her old legal circle, the crowd from her paralegal days at Okafor and Associates, she'd grown increasingly distant since he'd turned down that Nashville expansion opportunity. Crystal had wanted the move badly, had already started looking at houses in Belmead, talking about country club memberships, but Damon knew his firm's strength was in the relationships he'd built here in Memphis. His father's voice again. "Don't chase what looks shinier. Chase what's real." Crystal hadn't seen it that way. "Sometimes I wonder if you built all this just to stay exactly where you started," she'd said one night, her voice sharp with disappointment. He gathered the documents into his leather portfolio, the one Crystal had given him for their 5th anniversary, back when her gifts still felt genuine rather than calculated. The morning light was starting to strengthen, painting long rectangles on the hardwood floors Crystal had insisted on during the renovation. Through the window, he could see his truck in the driveway, the same reliable F-150 he'd bought when he landed his first major contract. Crystal's BMW was still in the garage. They'd drive separately to the courthouse, like they did most places these days. She'd said something about having lunch plans afterward. The drive downtown was quiet, traffic still light at this hour. Damon took his usual route, past his father's old garage, now a quick lube, and through the neighborhoods where he'd done his first infrastructure surveys. Every street corner held a memory of building something, solving a problem, earning trust. The courthouse parking lot was nearly empty when he pulled in. He checked his watch, plenty of time before the 9 a.m. hearing. The security guard at the metal detector greeted him by name. Damon's firm had done the structural assessment for the building's West Wing expansion last year. When he pushed open the heavy doors to courtroom 3B, the first thing he noticed was how many people were already there. More than you'd expect for what Harold had called a routine proceeding. Then he saw Crystal, seated at the plaintiff's table. And beside her, not in the gallery, but right at the table, was Philip Okafor himself. Not just present, he was arranging documents with the practiced efficiency of lead counsel. Damon felt something shift in his chest. Not surprise exactly, but recognition. Like when you finally spot the crack in a foundation that explains all the symptoms you've been seeing. He took his seat beside Harold Bryce, set his portfolio on the table, and waited. The room was quiet except for the shuffle of papers and the soft squeak of chairs. Through the tall windows, the morning sun was filling the courtroom with clear, unforgiving light. Harold Bryce shifted uncomfortably in his chair as Philip Okafor methodically arranged documents across the plaintiff's table. The stack was much thicker than anything they'd prepared for. Damon watched silently, noting how Okafor's perfectly tailored suit matched the leather of his briefcase, the kind of detail that spoke of careful image cultivation. "Don't worry," Harold whispered, though his voice betrayed his own concern. "We have the original documentation. This is still just a contract dispute." Damon nodded once, keeping his expression neutral. He'd learned long ago that reacting too quickly to surprising developments usually made things worse, not better. Judge Constance Barrow entered, and the room rose. She was known for running a tight courtroom and had little patience for theatrics. As everyone settled back into their seats, Okafor stood with practiced grace. "Your Honor," he began, "what we have here is not a simple contract dispute, but a case of systematic intellectual property appropriation spanning nearly a decade." Harold's pen scratched sharply across his legal pad. This wasn't the opening they'd expected. "The evidence will show," Okafor continued, "that Mrs. Price was not merely a paper co-owner, but a founding architect of Price Infrastructure Consulting's core methodology, specifically their proprietary structural load analysis process. The air seemed to thicken in the courtroom. Damon felt his jaw tighten, but kept his face carefully blank. That methodology had taken him 6 years to develop, working nights and weekends long before he'd even met Crystal. Okafor produced a series of documents, partnership agreements, development notes, consultation records, all suggesting Crystal's deep involvement in the firm's fundamental intellectual property. The paper trail was meticulous, each document notarized and dated. "Objection, Your Honor," Harold stammered, rising halfway from his chair. "These documents weren't included in the original filing. We haven't had time to—" "These were submitted last week under supplemental evidence rules," Okafor smoothly interrupted. "Your office signed for them on Tuesday." Judge Barrow checked her files and nodded. "Objection overruled. Continue, Mr. Okafor." Harold sank back, flipping frantically through his notes. Damon could feel the momentum of the room shifting, like watching a load-bearing wall start to buckle. Next came the expert witness, Dr. James Morton, introduced as an independent business consultant. He testified to personally observing Crystal's contributions to the methodology during the firm's early days. His credentials were impressive, his manner professional and assured. What no one mentioned was his long-standing connection to Okafor's private circle. The testimony continued for nearly an hour. Harold attempted several objections, each one deflected by Okafor's precise procedural knowledge. The case they'd prepared for, a straightforward contract review, had transformed into something else entirely. Judge Barrow reviewed the documentation carefully, her expression growing more serious with each page. When she finally looked up, her decision felt heavy in the air before she spoke. Based on the evidence presented, this court finds in favor of the plaintiff. Mrs. Price is awarded $5 million in equity damages, plus $300,000 in legal fees, to be paid within 30 days. The gallery exhaled collectively. Harold started speaking immediately about appeals and stays. But Damon wasn't listening. He was watching Crystal. She turned in her chair, meeting his eyes directly for the first time that morning. Her smile wasn't the relief of someone vindicated. It was the satisfaction of a long-laid plan finally bearing fruit. This wasn't a victory. It was a harvest. Okafor leaned close to her ear, whispering something that made her laugh softly. As they stood to leave, his hand moved to the small of her back with familiar ease. The gesture hit Damon like a physical thing. 3 weeks ago, he'd seen Okafor's name in Crystal's phone. Not as a contact, but as a saved voicemail she'd replayed 3 times in one night, thinking Damon was asleep beside her. He'd recognized the same intimate tone in her whispered responses then. The courtroom was emptying now. Damon gathered his papers with steady hands, nodding mechanically as Harold outlined their options. Through the open doors, he could hear Crystal's voice in the marble corridor, bright with triumph. "It's done," she was saying into her phone. "Just like we planned." The words echoed off the polished stone, carrying clearly back to where Damon stood. He closed his portfolio carefully, making sure the clasp clicked shut properly. Some things, once closed, stayed that way. In the marble corridor, Damon stood with Harold Bryce, pretending to review appeal options while Crystal's voice carried clearly from 20 feet away. She was still on her phone, practically glowing with victory as she paced in her expensive heels. "Yes, exactly as we discussed," she said, her tone bright and confident. "The full amount. $5 million plus fees." She paused, listening. No, he just sat there. Didn't say a word. Another laugh, softer this time. Harold shuffled through papers, talking about emergency stays and procedural reviews. Damon nodded occasionally, but his attention remained fixed on the familiar way Crystal moved as she spoke. The same movements he'd watched across breakfast tables for 11 years, now performed for a different audience. The corridor slowly emptied as other cases were called. Crystal ended her call, but immediately started another, this time speaking in low tones to someone whose responses made her smile. Okafor stood nearby, checking messages on his phone with the relaxed posture of a man who had just won exactly what he expected to win. 63 minutes ticked past on the old courthouse clock. A court officer appeared at the corridor's end, moving with purpose. "Mr. Price? Mrs. Price?" He glanced between them. "Judge Barrow requests both parties return to her courtroom immediately." Crystal's phone lowered slowly. She looked to Okafor, who had straightened from his casual pose. Something flickered across her face, the first crack in her triumphant composure. "Is there a problem?" Okafor asked smoothly. "Judge Barrow will explain," the officer replied. "Please follow me." They filed back into the courtroom. The afternoon light through the tall windows had shifted, casting different shadows across the worn wooden benches. Judge Barrow sat at her bench, her expression considerably colder than it had been an hour ago. "Please be seated," she said once they were all in place. Her tone had changed, the particular chill of someone who had discovered manipulation in their own domain. What Crystal didn't know, couldn't know, was that 3 days before the hearing, Damon had quietly submitted a preliminary evidence packet to the court's fraud intake division. He'd done it through a third party, keeping his name off the initial filing. The packet wasn't comprehensive enough to stop the proceedings, but it contained just enough specific documentation to trigger authentication flags on 2 key exhibits. Judge Barrow looked down at a fresh document on her bench. The court's document examiner has completed an initial review of the partnership agreement submitted as Exhibit C. The notary seal and registration number correspond to a notary whose Tennessee license was suspended 18 months ago. She paused, letting that settle. This suspension predates the document's alleged signing by several months. The gallery went silent. Crystal's hands tightened on the table edge. Given this finding, Barrow continued, this court has no choice but to immediately vacate the $5 million judgment pending a full fraud investigation. Her gaze swept the room. To be absolutely clear, this is not a delay or modification. The award is legally nullified. Mrs. Price will not receive any portion of it unless and until these authentication issues are fully resolved. Okafor was already writing rapidly on his legal pad. Harold Bryce sat completely still, looking as stunned as everyone else. Furthermore, Barrow added, if the fraud finding is confirmed through investigation, this claim will be dismissed with prejudice. That means it cannot be refiled in any form, in any court, at any time. She closed the file with finality. This hearing is adjourned pending the Fraud Division's full review. Crystal's carefully maintained composure cracked visibly. She turned to Okafor, who was now whispering urgently in her ear. His expression tense. The intimate confidence from earlier had vanished, replaced by the sharp calculation of a man measuring his own legal exposure. Damon stood slowly, straightening his jacket with the same careful precision he applied to everything. He didn't speak, didn't look at Crystal, didn't acknowledge the gallery's murmurs or Harold's stammered question. He simply walked out, steps measured and unhurried, leaving his wife standing beside an attorney whose whispers were already shifting from reassurance to distance. The heavy courtroom door closed behind him with a solid, final click. Morning light filtered through Aunt Ruth Ann's kitchen window, catching dust motes in its beam. The old copper kettle whistled on the stove, the same kettle she'd used for Sunday coffee since Damon was a boy. Without asking if he wanted any, she poured 2 cups and set one in front of him. Ruth Ann Price moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who had seen enough of life to stop being surprised by it. At 68, her face carried the kind of wisdom that came from watching people rather than judging them. She settled into the chair across from Damon, wrapped her weathered hands around her coffee mug, and waited. The hearing didn't go how Crystal expected, Damon said finally, his voice steady. Ruth Ann nodded. She'd never liked Crystal, not out of jealousy or spite, but from the quiet recognition of someone performing a role rather than living it. She'd kept that opinion to herself all these years, respecting Damon's right to make his own choices. 3 weeks ago, Damon continued, I found Okafor's name in her phone, not in her contacts. A saved voicemail she played 3 times in one night when she thought I was asleep. He took a slow sip of coffee. She left her phone unlocked on the nightstand. I wasn't looking for anything, but once I saw it, you started looking for everything, Ruth Ann finished. The documents they submitted yesterday, I recognized the fraud immediately. The partnership agreement was dated before we were even married, claiming she helped develop the load analysis process. The notary's seal looked wrong. His fingers traced the rim of his coffee cup. I submitted a preliminary packet to the court's fraud division 3 days before the hearing, just enough to trigger an authentication review. Ruth Ann listened without interruption, her expression neither triumphant nor surprised. This was her gift to him, pure witness, holding space for his truth without requiring him to manage her reaction to it. Wendell's running the forensics now, Damon said, going through every financial record from the past 5 years, looking for patterns. He paused. He's thorough. If there's anything to find, he'll find it. Wendell's a good friend, Ruth Ann observed quietly. He is. Damon's voice carried the weight of long trust. He dropped everything when I called him last week. Started the audit that night. Ruth Ann studied her nephew's face, the same quiet strength she'd seen in his father, her brother, who'd run an honest mechanic shop for 30 years on nothing but skill and reputation. "How long have you known?" she asked finally. "Long enough," Damon replied. The kitchen fell silent, except for the soft ticking of the old wall clock. Ruth Ann didn't press for more. She understood that Damon's measured response wasn't evasion, it was precision. He had known exactly long enough to build what needed building. "I need to call Wendell," Damon said after a while. "Check on the audit timeline." Ruth Ann nodded and stood, taking their empty cups to the sink. She watched through the window as Damon stepped onto her back porch, phone in hand. His posture was straight, unhurried, the same careful composure he'd maintained since boyhood. The call was brief. Damon's voice carried faintly through the screen door. "Still on schedule? Good. Let me know as soon as you have anything concrete." When he came back inside, Ruth Ann was drying her hands on a dish towel. "You're going home?" she asked. "Yes. I'll sleep in the guest room." "Crystal doesn't need to know anything's changed yet." Ruth Ann touched his arm lightly as he passed. "Not comfort, just connection. You know where to find me." That evening, Damon sat alone in his home office, surrounded by firm financial records spread across his desk. The house was quiet. Crystal had gone to her sister's for dinner, probably seeking sympathy about the hearing's unexpected turn. He could hear the faint hum of the central air, the occasional car passing outside. His fingers moved methodically through bank statements and operating reports, looking for patterns Wendell might not have reached yet. Each document was a piece of a larger picture, one he intended to see in full before making his next move. In the guest room down the hall, fresh sheets waited on a neatly made bed. He had changed them himself that afternoon, saying nothing to Crystal about his sleeping arrangements. The quiet man carried his plans like his father had carried tools, organized, accessible, ready for precise application when the moment called. Damon's phone buzzed at exactly 10:15 a.m. Wendell Osei's name lit up the screen, marked with the encrypted call indicator they'd set up 2 weeks ago. He stepped away from his drafting table and closed his office door. "Brother, it's worse than we thought." Wendell's voice was tight with controlled anger. "Much worse." Damon sat down, his movements deliberate. "Tell me." 22 months of systematic fund diversion, Wendell said. They averaged $17,000 monthly, hidden in padded vendor invoices, all of it routed to an LLC called Holloway Consulting Group. Damon's pen moved across his notepad, recording numbers with mechanical precision. Gloria's company, if you can call it that. The LLC has never filed a single consulting report, never showed any actual business activity. It's a shell, Damon. And here's the kicker. The mailing address matches Philip Okafor's personal residence in Belmead. The pen paused. "You're certain?" "I triple-checked. Property records, utility bills, mail forwarding. Everything confirms it. They weren't even trying to hide it well. They just assumed no one would look closely enough." Damon did the math silently. 22 months at $17,000 per month. $380,000. Give or take a few thousand, Wendell confirmed. And based on the timeline of these transfers, the affair started 4 years ago. The equity lawsuit wasn't about compensation, Damon. It was their exit strategy. They were planning to hollow out your firm before she walked. The morning light slanted through Damon's office window, catching dust motes in its beam. He watched them drift, his mind assembling the pieces with engineering precision. "The timing matches," he said finally. 4 years ago was when Crystal started spending more time with Okafor's legal circle, when she began pushing for the Nashville expansion, which you declined. "Yes." Damon's voice remained steady. "The numbers didn't justify it. The risk profile was too high for our operational model. So they created their own expansion plan," Wendell said grimly. "Using your money." Damon set his pen down carefully. "I need you to prepare a complete documentation package. Format it for both the Tennessee Bar Association and the Federal Fraud Division. Every transfer, every padded invoice, every connection between the LLC and Okafor's address. Already started, Wendell replied. I'll have preliminary drafts ready by Friday. You want the timeline to include the affair markers? Everything, Damon confirmed. Build it clean, build it complete. They discussed technical details for another 10 minutes. Bank records, wire transfer confirmations, property documentation. Wendell's voice carried the focused intensity of a man who took financial fraud personally. This wasn't just about helping a friend. This was about professional offense. Just after lunch, Harold Bryce called. The mid-tier attorney sounded uncomfortable, like a man carrying a message he didn't believe in. Crystal's team has submitted a settlement offer, he said. Through Okafor. Damon waited. They're proposing to drop the fraud investigation entirely, in exchange for a quiet settlement of $1.2 million. Harold paused. They're framing it as a mutual face-saving arrangement. The sunlight had shifted, throwing Damon's shadow across his drafting table. He thought about Crystal's smile in the courtroom, about Okafor's hand on her back, about 4 years of calculated extraction, masked as marriage. Would you like me to draft a detailed response? Harold asked into the silence. No, Damon said. Send them one word. No. Just no? Exactly that. Damon's voice was perfectly level. Nothing else. After hanging up, he returned to the financial records spread across his desk. The morning's revelation had transformed them from numbers into evidence. Each transfer a documented betrayal. Each padded invoice a brick in the wall Crystal and Okafor had built between truth and appearance. His phone buzzed again. Wendell. I've been thinking, his friend said without preamble. We should meet in person this week. Go through everything together before we finalize the package. Agreed, Damon replied. Your office or mine? Yours, Friday morning. I'll bring every piece of documentation we have. They set the time, 7 a.m., before regular business hours. Damon would have coffee waiting. They both understood that what they were building wasn't just a case. It was an architecture of consequence, and every joint had to be perfect. The Tennessee Bar Association building stood quiet in the early morning light, its limestone facade reflecting the sun's first rays. Damon adjusted his tie, checked his watch, 7:45 a.m., and walked through the heavy glass doors with a leather portfolio under his arm. Margaret at reception recognized him from his infrastructure presentations to the Civic Engineering Board. She smiled warmly. Mr. Price, ethics intake is on 3. Mr. Chen is expecting you. James Chen stood when Damon entered, extending his hand. They had served together on Nashville's Infrastructure Planning Committee 2 years ago. Chen's reputation for ethical precision had made him Damon's first and only choice for this meeting. Thank you for making time, Damon said, taking the offered seat. Professional courtesy, Chen replied carefully. Though I should note, this isn't a favor. It's a standard intake meeting. Understood completely. Damon placed his portfolio on the desk. I'm here to submit documentation regarding attorney misconduct by Philip Okafor. Chen's expression remained neutral as Damon laid out the first set of documents. Wendell's meticulously organized financial audit showing the connection between Holloway Consulting Group and Okafor's personal residence. Each page was annotated with corresponding bank records, wire transfers, and property documentation. The LLC was used to divert firm funds, Damon explained. $380,000 over 22 months. Mr. Okafor's home address appears as the mailing address on all official documentation. Next came the notary fraud evidence, enlarged copies of the backdated partnership agreement showing the suspended notary's license number, along with official verification of the suspension date from the state registry. Chen examined each page methodically, making occasional notes. His face revealed nothing. Finally, Damon removed a sealed envelope containing a USB drive and a certified transcript. This contains an audio recording of a conversation between Mr. Okafor and my wife, Crystal Price. captured by licensed investigator Marcus Webb on April 12th. He placed another document beside it, a household shared device disclosure form dated 2 years prior, bearing Crystal's clear signature. This authorized monitoring of shared household devices. My wife signed it during a routine paperwork update. She appears to have forgotten its existence. Chen picked up the disclosure form, studying it. And the content of the recording? Mr. Okafor explicitly discusses timing the fraudulent equity lawsuit around my firm's federal contract cycle. The exact quote is, "Once the 12 million hits the books, we file. Maximum leverage, maximum exposure." The investigator's certification and chain of custody documentation are included. Chen set the form down carefully. What he didn't tell Damon, what he couldn't tell him, was that a separate drawer in his filing cabinet already held a folder with Okafor's name on it. 2 previous client conflicts, buried through careful settlements and called-in favors, had been accumulating dust and potential for years. Okafor had survived them through reputation and connections. But this submission was different. This was the load-bearing wall that, once removed, would bring everything else down with it. "I'll review these materials thoroughly," Chen said. "You understand I can't discuss any other matters that may or may not exist regarding Mr. Okafor." "Of course." Damon stood, straightening his jacket. "Thank you for your time." As he drove back across town, his phone buzzed twice. Crystal, calling from her sister's number. He let both calls go to voicemail. The house was silent when he arrived home. He moved through each room slowly, not from nostalgia, but with the careful attention of an engineer conducting a site survey. In the kitchen, he noted which appliances he had purchased before the marriage. In the living room, he catalogued furniture. The leather armchair was his. The decorative mirrors were hers. The home office contained his professional library and drafting equipment. Upstairs, he paused at the master bedroom doorway. The king bed they had chosen together would need to be replaced. Too many memories embedded in its frame. The walk-in closet held 11 years of accumulated shared life, but he could already separate what would stay and what needed to go. In Crystal's vanity drawer, a small velvet box caught his eye. Inside was the anniversary watch he had given her 3 years ago, a Cartier, chosen carefully to match her taste. She had left it behind when she packed her immediate necessities for her sister's house. He closed the box and returned it to the drawer. Another item for the inventory of things that were no longer what they appeared to be. Gloria Holloway's ranch-style house sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, its faded yellow paint and well-tended flower beds speaking of middle-class comfort maintained through careful routine. Damon parked his car along the curb and walked up the concrete path, noting how the morning sun cast long shadows across Gloria's prized rose bushes. His knock echoed in the morning stillness. After a moment, the door opened to reveal Gloria in a pale blue housecoat, her gray hair loosely pinned back. The moment their eyes met, her face fell, not in surprise, but with the particular weariness of someone who had been rehearsing this moment in sleepless nights. "I wondered when you'd come," she said softly, stepping back to let him in. The living room was exactly as Crystal had described it over the years. Family photos arranged precisely on beige walls, furniture chosen for durability rather than style, everything clean, but nothing quite new. Gloria gestured to an armchair while she took her usual place on the floral print sofa. Damon sat without speaking. From his leather portfolio, he removed a single document and placed it on the coffee table between them. The LLC registration lay there like a weapon, Gloria's signature clearly visible at the bottom. She stared at it for a long moment, then began speaking in a voice that seemed to come from very far away. "She came to me 2 years ago," Gloria said, "right after your firm got that big federal contract. She had everything planned already, the lawsuit, the documents, all of it. But when that $12 million deal came through, she decided to wait." Gloria's hands twisted in her lap. She said it would be worth more if she gave it time to grow. Damon remained still, his face neutral. Sunlight through the window caught the edge of a crystal vase, sending rainbow fragments across the wall. The counseling sessions, Gloria continued, her voice catching. She recorded all of them, gave the tapes to Philip. They were trying to build something about emotional abuse, about control. She looked up at Damon finally. But you never gave them anything. The therapist, she told Crystal later that you were always the one really trying, always honest, always willing to work. A clock ticked steadily on the mantel. Outside, a lawnmower started somewhere down the street, its distant drone filtering through the windows. I registered the company because she asked me to, Gloria said. Her voice had grown smaller. She's my daughter. I've always trusted her judgment over my own. Even when I knew. She stopped, pressing her hands to her mouth. Tears began rolling down her cheeks. She had it all mapped out. The timing, the documents, everything. Said you'd never notice the money because you trusted her completely. Said you were too focused on building things to see what was happening right in front of you. Damon's expression remained unchanged, but his fingers tightened slightly on the portfolio's leather edge. Every month, more transfers. Every time I signed something, I told myself it was just business, just helping my daughter secure her future. Gloria's shoulders shook. But I knew. God help me. I knew what we were doing to you. She was fully crying now, decades of carefully maintained composure crumbling in the morning light. The tears fell onto her housecoat, leaving dark spots on the pale blue fabric. Damon reached for the LLC registration and returned it to his portfolio. He stood, straightening his jacket with the same precise movement he used in court. "Thank you for your honesty," he said quietly. Gloria looked up at him through her tears, perhaps hoping for some sign of forgiveness or understanding. She found neither. Damon's face remained as controlled as it had been in every couple's counseling session Crystal had tried to weaponize against him. He walked to the door, his footsteps silent on Gloria's carefully vacuumed carpet. She didn't rise to see him out. She remained on the sofa, hands clutched together, watching the last piece of her carefully constructed justifications collapse. The morning air felt cooler when Damon stepped outside. He walked to his car and sat behind the wheel, looking at the house where Crystal had grown up, learning that security was something you took rather than built. He pulled out his phone and called Aunt Ruth Ann. When she answered, he spoke 4 words that contained everything he had learned in that floral print living room. "I have everything." The fluorescent lights hummed quietly in Damon's conference room as he and Wendell worked methodically through stacks of documents spread across the polished table. It was just past 7 in the evening, and the rest of the office had cleared out hours ago. 3 identical black portfolios lay open, each labeled with post-it notes in Wendell's precise handwriting: TN Bar, Federal, and Divorce. "Let's go through the bar complaint one more time," Wendell said, adjusting his reading glasses. He pulled the first portfolio closer, flipping through tabbed sections with practiced efficiency. Ethics violation documentation, recorded conversation transcript, and the full financial trace showing Okafor's address matching the LLC. Damon nodded, reviewing his own copy of the index. Audio files on the encrypted USB? 2 copies, Wendell confirmed. Original and backup, both with chain of custody documentation. The timestamp on Crystal's voice matches the shared device disclosure date perfectly. They moved to the Federal Fraud Division package next. Wendell had organized it with the same methodical precision he brought to every audit. The complete forensic accounting laid out in clear, irrefutable detail. Every diverted dollar was traced, every fraudulent invoice documented. Gloria's written statement sat in its own section, her handwriting steady despite the emotion behind the words. "The notary fraud evidence?" Damon asked. Wendell tapped a blue-tabbed section. Court examiner's preliminary finding. License verification showing the suspension date and the original document with the fraudulent seal. Authentication reports attached. The third portfolio, marked for Damon's divorce attorney, contained the most comprehensive assembly: asset fraud filing, clawback triggers, penalty calculations, everything needed to legally dismantle the financial architecture Crystal had spent years constructing. Interest is calculated through next quarter, Wendell noted, indicating a spreadsheet. 380 plus penalties comes to just over $500,000 when you factor in the statutory rates. Damon picked up his phone and checked the time. Federal contract disclosure next? They pulled up the carefully worded letter to the Infrastructure Contract Oversight Committee. Damon had drafted it himself, striking a perfect balance between transparency and control. Every sentence acknowledged the investigation while demonstrating his proactive cooperation. "This is good," Wendell said, reading it again. "Shows you caught it, you're handling it, and you came to them first. Puts you ahead of any narrative Crystal might try to spin." Damon signed 3 copies of the disclosure letter, while Wendell prepared certified mail labels for each portfolio. The clock on the wall ticked steadily as they double-checked every index, every tab, every piece of documentation that would land simultaneously on 3 different desks tomorrow morning. "Delivery confirmations are set up?" Damon asked, sealing the last envelope. Wendell nodded. "All 3 packages are scheduled for 9 a.m. delivery. I've got tracking numbers for each one." He paused, looking at his friend. "You know what happens when these land?" "I do," Damon said simply. They worked in comfortable silence for another 20 minutes, verifying final details. Wendell had known Damon long enough to understand that his quiet wasn't hesitation. It was focus. The same precise attention he brought to load-bearing calculations was present in every document they'd prepared. When everything was finally ready, Damon stood and began gathering his things. Wendell watched him move around the conference room with the same measured efficiency he'd shown throughout the process. "You're sure about the timing?" Wendell asked, not because he doubted, but because he needed to hear it one more time. "Crystal's still operating on her original schedule," Damon said, shutting down his laptop. "She thinks she has weeks to regroup after the court reversal. She's wrong." They carried the portfolios down to the lobby together. Wendell would handle the deliveries personally in the morning. One more layer of precise control in an operation built on attention to detail. The night air was cool as they walked to their cars. The city had quieted, most offices dark, traffic thinned to occasional passing headlights. Damon looked up at his firm's building. 15 years of work contained in steel and glass, the legacy Crystal had tried to hollow out from within. "Get some sleep," Wendell said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Everything's ready." Damon nodded, unlocking his car. He watched Wendell's taillights disappear around the corner, then drove home through empty streets. The house was dark when he arrived, still and quiet in a way it hadn't been when Crystal lived there. For the first time in weeks, he didn't lie awake analyzing angles and checking details. Everything was in motion now, precisely positioned, each document and disclosure aimed exactly where it needed to land. He slept deeply, without dreams, while 3 black portfolios waited in Wendell's office for morning delivery. Damon sat at his desk reviewing structural calculations when his phone buzzed 3 times in quick succession. 3 separate delivery confirmation emails, each time-stamped 9:02 a.m. He opened them one by one, noting the signatures: Tennessee Bar Association Office of Ethics, Federal Fraud Division Intake Coordinator, his divorce attorney's legal assistant. Every package had landed exactly as planned. He set the phone down and returned to his calculations, letting the morning unfold at its own pace. The first tremor arrived at 10:47 a.m., when Crystal's new attorney called her with news of the federal complaint. Damon didn't witness this directly, but he could reconstruct it from the frantic series of texts that began lighting up his phone. Messages from Crystal that he let accumulate unread. By noon, word of the bar complaint had reached Okafor's office. The ethics investigation notification would have landed on his desk, along with the supporting documentation, financial records, recorded conversations, Gloria's statement. Damon imagined Okafor's practiced composure cracking as he realized the full scope of exposure. Not just Crystal's fraud, but his own buried history surfacing alongside it. Crystal's first indication that Okafor was distancing himself came when her calls to his office were met with polite deflection from his secretary. By 2 o'clock, he had stopped responding to her messages entirely. The practiced warmth that had drawn her in, the intimate attention she had built her future around, vanished as completely as if it had never existed. The third blow landed at 3:15 p.m., when Crystal attempted to access her primary bank account and found it flagged pending forensic review. The clawback filing had triggered an immediate freeze on all accounts associated with the Holloway Consulting Group LLC. Not just Crystal's personal accounts, but the shell company itself, and, by extension, her mother's linked finances. Damon's phone continued to buzz periodically throughout the afternoon. Crystal's messages grew increasingly urgent, then desperate, then angry. He let each notification fade unanswered. He had said everything he needed to say through documentation. The following morning, while Crystal was standing in her sister's kitchen, trying to figure out how to access backup funds, a courier arrived with a letter from Philip Okafor's new attorney. Not from Okafor himself, from Greenwood and Associates, Criminal Defense. Crystal recognized the firm's letterhead. They handled high-stakes, professional misconduct cases. The letter was 3 paragraphs long, written in the bloodless language of legal self-preservation. Okafor was withdrawing as her counsel, citing irreconcilable conflict of interest. All future communication should be directed through his new representation. The firm would not be accepting calls regarding this matter. The letter was signed by James Greenwood, founding partner. Okafor's signature was nowhere on the page. Crystal read it twice, then 3 times, standing motionless in her sister's sunny kitchen. The marble countertop she was leaning against probably cost what her mother's house was worth. She had imagined hosting dinner parties here with Philip, both of them laughing about how far they'd come. Now he wouldn't even sign his own withdrawal letter. She had traded everything for him: 11 years of marriage, her mother's financial security, her professional reputation, her integrity. She had believed completely in the future he described, the life they would build together once Damon was out of the way. She had never been his partner. She had been his most useful client, and now she was his liability. He had discarded her with the same practiced efficiency he had used to seduce her. Her hands were shaking when she picked up her phone to call Damon. She had left him 6 messages yesterday, each one carefully controlled, professional, attempting to negotiate. This time her voice cracked on the first word. The composure she had maintained through years of calculated deception finally fractured. The call went straight to voicemail. She left a message that started as an attempt at explanation and devolved into something raw and desperate that she couldn't take back. In his office, Damon felt his phone vibrate. He glanced at the screen, saw Crystal's number, and let it ring through to voicemail. A minute later, the notification appeared. He picked up the phone and played the message, listening without expression to Crystal's voice. Stripped of its polish for the first time since he'd known her, all pretense finally burned away. When the message ended, he set the phone face down on his desk and returned to his structural calculations. There were load points to verify, stress tolerances to confirm. The work continued, methodical and precise, while Crystal stood in her sister's kitchen holding a letter from the man she'd destroyed her marriage to be with, who had just demonstrated exactly how much her devotion had been worth. Damon arrived at his firm's conference room 30 minutes early. The morning sun slanted through the east-facing windows, casting long shadows across the polished table. He positioned 2 chairs facing each other, leaving the rest pushed against the walls. The simplicity felt right. No barriers, no distractions, just 2 points of focus. He didn't prepare notes or arrange documents. Everything that needed saying was already filed, delivered, and in motion. He sat in the chair facing the door and waited. Crystal arrived exactly on time, wearing a navy suit that hung slightly loose on her frame. Her makeup was perfect, but couldn't quite mask the shadows under her eyes. She hesitated in the doorway for a moment before stepping inside. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, her voice steady but thin. Damon gestured to the empty chair. Crystal sat, smoothing her skirt with hands that trembled slightly. She looked around the conference room, a space she had helped design 4 years ago, choosing the artwork, selecting the furniture. Now she was a visitor. "I know things got out of hand," she began, attempting warmth. "But we can still fix this. There's no reason to destroy everything we built." Damon said nothing. Her tone shifted to injured dignity. "You could have talked to me. We were married for 11 years. I deserved at least a conversation." Still nothing. Anger crept in. "You're being vindictive. This isn't just about me anymore. My mother is involved. Her savings are frozen. Is that what you wanted?" Damon watched her cycle through these personas, conciliatory, wounded, accusatory, like she was trying different keys in a lock. When none of them produced a response, she finally asked the real question. "Why didn't you just confront me when you found out?" Damon spoke for the first time, his voice quiet and precise. "Because confrontation is for people who want to be heard. I wanted to be free. There's a difference." He laid out her situation with architectural clarity. The fraud finding would permanently dismiss her claim with prejudice. She would never be able to refile it in any form. The clawback provision required full restitution of the $380,000 plus substantial penalties. The bar investigation into Okafor was already expanding beyond their case. The federal fraud referral would create a permanent civil record. Crystal listened, her composure cracking further with each detail. When he finished, she reached for her last piece of leverage. "I have recordings," she said, "from our counseling sessions. Things you said?" Damon reached into his jacket and placed a single sheet of paper on the table between them. Crystal stared at it, recognition dawning slowly. The shared device disclosure form she had signed 2 years ago, buried in a stack of routine household paperwork. The form that made every recording legally obtained and inadmissible as leverage. "You always read everything," she said quietly. "Yes," he replied. "I did." He stood, straightening his jacket. "I need you to vacate the house by Friday. Your personal belongings will be boxed and available for pickup. The movers have been instructed to document everything." Crystal remained seated, looking up at him. "That's it? 11 years, and that's it?" "I wish you no harm, Crystal," Damon said. He meant it. She studied his face for a long moment, searching for something. Anger, triumph, anything that would make this feel like a fight rather than a correction. Finding nothing, she stood and walked out without another word. 18 months passed like water finding its level. The civil fraud finding came down against Crystal and Gloria, requiring full restitution plus penalties. The $5 million claim was permanently closed. Okafor's disbarment proceeding concluded, with his license revoked and his carefully cultivated judgeship track destroyed. Damon's firm expanded to Nashville with 11 staff. He bought a smaller house east of Memphis, older, solid bones, but needing work. He spent weekends rebuilding it room by room, the same patience he applied to everything else guiding each repair. One Saturday morning, he visited his father's old garage, now a community auto shop he funded quietly, his name appearing nowhere but the deed. A teenager was struggling with a '98 Civic that wouldn't start, frustration evident in every movement. Damon watched for a moment, then walked over. He didn't take the tools or the lead. Instead, he crouched beside the boy and began asking questions, guiding him through the diagnostic process letting him discover each step. When the engine finally turned over, the pride on the kid's face was worth more than any signed check. Damon stood back, pulled off his work gloves, and watched the engine idle smoothly. The sound filled the garage. Not quite music, but something honest and complete. He drove home in the particular quiet he had discovered over the past year and a half. Not emptiness, space, room to build whatever came next. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.